Well, last week we started a series on the power of grace, and Ron spoke on being more than conquerors from Romans 8. If you can cast your mind back that far, that was a very good message, and living in the overcoming, allowing the Holy Spirit to help us overcome sin and to live for Him. And he said, God's for us and He loves us, and we can know that. So let's go into the message this morning, remembering that. This week, I am going to speak from Philippians 4, and a verse that probably many of you will know and will have seen written on, little encouraging cards and all sorts of things over the years. And a personal favourite for me, because it was my bapa, my grandfather's favourite verse as well. I know many of you will remember him. Maybe some of you don't. That's okay. But his favourite verse was, "I can do everything through Him who gives me strength." My cousin, who he hasn't grown up in church, but spent a lot of time with my grandparents and just loved them, and they just that relationship between grandparents and grandkids. My cousin, when my grandfather passed away, actually got that verse tattooed onto her foot, and I think of it every time I read it. I think of the tattoo and I think of my grandfather. I can do everything through Him who gives me strength. But I think that because this is such one of those verses that you do see on cards and that sort of thing all the time, it is a verse that is usually, often, taken out of context. And in order to really understand, what it is that it's saying, we need to understand it within the context that Paul wrote it in. And, I think that often we can use it to be, I can achieve all the goals that I want to achieve. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. There's a song that we used to do as well, which every time I think of it, I have it in my head at the moment because of that. No, not doing that. But for those of you who care, which will be maybe one of you or two of you and no one else, it was the first synth bit that I ever learnt when I was playing keyboard. It was the first little bit. Lisa worked it out and used to play it, and it was this little trumpety bit. Anyway, lots of fun. Yes, context. It is a song. It is a verse that can often be taken out of context and used as sort of a personal motivation, to achieve the goals that we want to achieve. But I think we need to understand it within the context of Philippians. So I want to give you just a very brief history of the church in Philippi, because that is who Paul was writing to when he wrote this letter. And also, I just really like history, so we're going to go there. So the church in Philippi was founded by Paul and the group that he was with at the time on one of his missionary journeys. It was the first church that was planted in Europe by them. And you might remember, those of you who know Acts, thank you very much, Pat, for the picture. We spent a while finding the right one this morning. Yes, you might remember in Acts that Paul had a vision of a man, telling him to come to Macedonia. And so he went to Macedonia, which is now what is modern-day Greece. I mean, Macedonia also exists as a country, but Philippi is in modern-day Greece now. And I'm going to show you where everything is on the map. I need like a little pointer. So this down here, Jerusalem in Israel, which is where they came from to begin with. And Philippi is whoosh, up there. It must be the Air Jordans. And then, I'm going to have to jump again. Up there is Rome, which is where most likely Paul was writing from at the time. He was imprisoned under house arrest up in Rome. So he was originally from down there in Jerusalem. The church that he's writing to is over there in Philippi, which is now northeastern Greece. And he's writing from up there. And you can imagine that's a long way to go. Like in those days, they didn't have direct transfer of money to support each other. They didn't have planes that they could go on to get there really quickly and easily. I mean, that would be so quick to get there now, but would have taken such a long time to get from place to place back in those days, which is why I wanted to show you like the whole picture, because they were a long way away from each other. So that's where they were. So this was the church that Paul planted. You might remember that they found Lydia, who was a seller of purple cloth, and she was saved, and her household was saved. And then when Paul cast out a demon from a girl who had an evil spirit, they were put in jail, Paul and Silas, and they praised God, and there was an earthquake and the walls came down, but they did not leave, they didn't escape, and then the jailer also came to know God. So that is where this church is planted. That was sort of the beginning of the church. And now, all these years later, Paul is writing to them again. And he's writing for them primarily to thank them for a gift that they had given him, that they had sent from Philippi all the way up to Rome through a man called Epaphroditus, who got very sick and almost died in order to get it to them. And I want to tell you all of that to say that Paul and the church in Philippi had a very close partnership. He says in Philippians that the church in Philippi was the only church for a while there that actually supported him with money in the giving and receiving. And he calls them, talks about their partnership in the gospel. So he really considered them to be very close friends, and you can see that when you read Philippians. So he's writing this letter to them in order to thank them for this gift that that this man has quite literally almost died in order to bring him all that distance. He's also writing to them to encourage them to stand firm, because at that point in time, the church in Philippi was going through some pretty intense struggles. Philippi was a town that was very loyal to Rome and to the emperor, and they didn't particularly like the fact that the Christians in that town in that city, were saying, follow Jesus and look to him and be loyal to him. So they were undergoing quite a bit of persecution. And we also know that Paul at his end, he's in prison and he's gone through all this crazy stuff, is also going through some struggles. So he's writing to encourage them to stand firm in their faith, and he's also writing to encourage them to continue to get along with each other. There were a couple of women leaders who were not getting along very well, and he wanted to encourage them to stand together and stand in unity. So that's why he's writing this letter to them. So their relationship isn't just, church founder and teacher-student sort of relationship. It's a friend and friend relationship. And I want you to really understand that, the sort of the heart behind it. I think when you understand it as that sort of partnership in the gospel, friend and friend relationship, we can sort of all understand that because we have friends and we know what that looks like. We encourage each other when you're with your friend, and you support each other in whatever way you can, and you're there for each other. You're listening to each other, sharing your life together, whatever the circumstances are, you're there for each other. I have a friend who lives a very long distance from me, as I think you guys are going to see her very soon, which I'm very jealous about. It's almost a year since I was there and saw her. But I understand what it's like to be so far away from one of your closest friends and not, and still being able to support them and help them and to love them and to share life with them. So that's sort of where they're coming from. So in the midst of all of this, in the midst of all of the struggles that they're going through, the persecution that they're going under, these crazy distances that they're going to support each other, Paul then says in Philippians 4, which is where we find that verse, I can do everything through him who gives me strength. He says that he has learnt to be content no matter what the circumstances are that he faces. So let's have a look in Philippians 4. We're going to see this verse in context. Philippians 4, verse 10 to 13. He says, so he's talking here about the gift. This is the part of the letter where he's specifically thanking them for this gift that they've sent with Epaphroditus. He says, I rejoice greatly, in verse 10, I rejoice greatly in the Lord that at last you have renewed your concern for me. Indeed, you have been concerned, but you had no opportunity to show it. I'm not saying this because I am in need, for I have learnt to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learnt the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do everything through him who gives me strength. And I think that this is it's an amazing thing to say for someone who, when he says that he knows what it's like to have nothing, he really means he knows what it's like to have nothing. He knows what it's like to go through some really intense circumstances. And yet he's still saying, I can be content in all situations, and I can do all things through him who gives me strength. And I think Ron touched on it a little bit last week, but when he's talking about these circumstances that he's been going through, the things that have happened to him, we see in 2 Corinthians that he says, I'm just going to read a little bit from 2 Corinthians 11. He says, I've been in prison more frequently, been flogged more severely, been exposed to death again and again. 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1, which is the number of lashes that you can basically take and still be slightly alive, which is crazy. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned 3 times. I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and day in the open sea. I've been constantly on the move. I've been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my own countrymen, in danger from the Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, and in danger from false brothers. I've laboured and toiled and often gone without sleep. I've known hunger and thirst and have often gone without food. I've been cold and naked. Beside everything else, I face daily the pressure of my concern for all the churches. So when he's saying that he is content in all circumstances, it's not just a nice thing that he's saying. He's really saying that he's learnt the secret to being content in all circumstances, and he can do all things through him who gives him strength, who is Christ. And he says it twice in Philippians 4. He doesn't just say it once. He says, I've learnt to be content whatever the circumstances. And then he says again, I have learnt the secret of being content in any and every situation. And I want to point out that it's a journey. It's not something that he just woke up one day and was like, I can be content no matter what happens to me. But it's something that he's learnt over time through the things that he's been going through. He has learnt to be content. It's a journey. And I also want to point out that what he's saying isn't that I am content because of all of these things that have been happening to me. He's not saying that we should just, in our service to God, put up with, bad treatment or abuse or anything like that. He's not saying that. What he's saying is, despite all of those circumstances while he's serving God, he can be content in God despite what's going on around him. So I just don't want you to think that I'm condoning bad things happening to you or that you should just be putting up with bad things happening, but that we can still be content in who God is and his love for us and his grace that he gives us despite what's going on around us. So, understanding a little bit more the context that this was written in then, the question I think we should ask ourselves this morning is, how can we live this overcoming life where we are content in every circumstance, no matter what's going on, knowing that we can do all the things that he's called us to do in his strength? How can we live that overcoming life? So the first thing that I think we can see that Paul does, and the first thing that we can do, is to do what God has called you to do. One of the reasons I think this verse keeps getting taken out of context is because, like I said before, people use it in relation to, wanting to reach their own personal milestones or because they have their own goals and, I can do that because God gives me strength. But it's so much more than that. It's not about just reaching personal milestones. It's about the fact that God has called all of us to live a life that he's called us to. And it's going to look different for all of us because we're different people with different strengths, with different skills, with different backgrounds, we live very different lives. But God has called us all to live a particular life. He's calling us into that all the time. And when we live that life and obey him and listen to him and we're walking in the way that he's called us to walk, as we do that and as we do the things he's called us to do, God will provide what we need and he will help us to be content in all of those circumstances, even to the point, like Paul had, of intense persecution. So for Paul, when he was writing this, his life that God had called him to do involved, he originally thought it was, being one of the religious leaders in Israel, and we saw that he persecuted the churches there, the people in the churches there. But once he came to know God and started to follow him, for him what that ended up looking like was a whole heap of travelling. He went on 3 big missionary journeys. That picture's not there anymore, the map, but right around all of that area, he went on 3 big missionary journeys. There it is, around there. I think one of them is sort of shown there, but there were a couple more that he did. He did a lot of travelling. He did a lot of planting of churches. He did a lot of evangelizing. And he did this even while he was in prison. I'm so impressed reading Philippians about, even though he's in prison and he's gone through all this stuff, he's still laser focused on what God's called him to do. And he says, I'm here, and now the whole, the household of Caesar are starting to believe. And it's amazing how he's just so focused on what God's calling him to do, to the point where he knows that his imprisonment there could very well end in death. And he says in Philippians at the beginning, but for me to live is Christ and to die is gain. So this is the life that God has called him to live now. And the point I want to make for us all here is when we put his kingdom first, when we listen to what it is he's telling us to do every day, day by day, and then obey and do those things day by day, when we're living within his purpose for us, God gives us the strength to keep going. When he says, I can do all things, or I can do everything in him who gives me strength, he's not saying you can do everything you feel like doing, just whatever whim you have, and you can do it in him. He's saying when you walk the life that God has called you to live, he will make sure that you have the strength to do it. I think this is why it's really important that we have that daily relationship with God. That it's not just something, I had a vision years ago and now I'm just living this life, but it's a day-to-day relationship. And when we're listening to him every day and doing what he's called us to do every day, and usually that's going to be little things, like, God calls us into the big things and the big steps of faith at times. But mostly our life is made up of the little bits, that God calls us to do day by day, being faithful day by day, living what he's called us to do day by day. And as we do that and listen and have that relationship with him, and when we're open to the whispers of his spirit as we're going about our day, and when we're reading our Bible and meditating on who he is and sitting in stillness like we were singing, sitting in God's stillness, when we're worshiping him and we have that relationship with him, God gives us the strength to continue to do all the things he's called us to do. And so I want us to recognize as well, the difference between the things that God has called us to do and the things that are just good to do. I know that I can get really eager at times when I think I should be doing more. I don't know why I ever think that, barely any time as it is. But I think, I could do this and I could do this, and this looks like a really worthy cause. I could definitely be a part of that. But the point is not, is this a worthy cause? The point is this the worthy cause that God's called you to? So just, have a think about that. And I think there are seasons and times for things too. Like there are things that I've done in the past that God had called me to. Things like, I volunteered with refugees for a time. I was on the school P&C for a time. Those were all things that I definitely know God had called me to do at the time, but which are not for right now, not for this season right now. So that's why it's really important to have that relationship with him and to know what he's calling us to do. I think many of us will know the parable in Luke, I'm reading Luke at the moment, where he talks about the house that's built on sand and the house that's built on rock. And he talks about how, we all know we all want to have that house on the rock. We all want to have the strength that rock brings. But it actually says in Luke 6 that building the house on the rock it's like somebody who comes and hears God's words and then puts them into practice. We don't just have a house built on this strong foundation that God gives us because we're doing whatever we want to do. We have that foundation because God speaks to us and we hear and then we listen and obey. Yes, so my question for you is, what is it that God's calling you to do at the moment? How can you obey him this week? Is there something that he's calling you to do right now that you should be doing in order to walk in the purpose that God has strengthened you for? And also, is there anything that you're doing right now that you probably shouldn't be, and it's ready to, really ask God what his direction for you is? So how can you obey God this week? How can you obey him this month? What's he asking you to do this year? It might be a big thing. It's most likely lots and lots of little things. Cool. The second thing I think that we can do and that Paul demonstrates is to trust that he will provide. The fact that he can be content in all circumstances, even when he has nothing, I think is partly because he knows that God will provide for all of his needs. And he actually says that just a little bit after this verse in Philippians 4, verse 19. So he's responded, he's thanked the Philippians for this amazing gift that they've given him. And then normally what would happen in a friendship situation at the time is then you would reciprocate in some way. But Paul is all that distance away in Rome and is unable to get there and to reciprocate in the way that he would probably like to. And so he tells them in verse 19, Philippians 4, "And my God will meet all your needs according to his glorious riches in Christ Jesus." He's so confident in that, and I think that's because he knew that for himself. That was a lived experience for him. He had the strength to do what God had called him to do, and he could be content in all of these situations because he knew that God would provide and meet the needs as he continued to do what God had called him to do. I think it's quite comforting. God's not going to tell us to do something or call us to go down a particular path and then just leave us in the lurch when we're down there. If God has called you to do it, he will provide for you to do it. And I know for Adrian and I, this has definitely been our experience throughout the years. Every time we've put his kingdom first, every time we've obeyed him and gone somewhere new or done something new, he's always provided for us. He has provided the right houses in the right locations at the right time in sometimes quite amazing ways. He has provided exactly the right jobs at exactly the right time. That's something that's been quite big for me in the last few years, because after being a stay-at-home and parent for like 10, 11 years, I then studied and went back into the workforce for a few years now. And as I was doing that and applying for a heap of different jobs, I always went into it saying, God, if this isn't the right job for me, then I know I won't get it. That's okay. But if it is, I thank you, and I'm going to go in and do the best interview I can. But if it's not right for me, I know that you'll block it. And if it is right for me, that you'll let it go through. And the number of times I had people say, it was very, very close. It was just a split decision, but we've gone with this person with more experience, was always to me, oh, that's okay. That just wasn't right for me at the time. But looking at the job that I currently have now, I know that I am in exactly the place that God has called me to be. He's provided for our needs in exactly the right way. It's a job that, one that I absolutely love, with a team that I love. And I also know that if I had got some of those other jobs, one in particular, I would for certain have burnt out. I'm 100% certain of it. Another job, I know from chats with other people, that I would have been in a very toxic environment. And I'm just so grateful that God has provided and, given me what I needed at exactly the right time in order to provide for what we're doing. Another thing that God has done, when Adrian stepped out of his architectural job, however many years ago that was a bit of a scary thing for us, because that was a decrease in pay, and that's always a bit nerve-wracking when you've got children to provide for. But God has always provided, and to be honest, I haven't really even noticed the lack. It's always been there. Even though it's tight at times, the money's always been there. And I know for us personally as well, there are things coming up in the future, decisions that we've made for our kids and for ourselves, that we know what God's called us to do. And I don't really know at the moment where any of the finance or any of the provision for that is coming from, but I know it will come. And so when I say this, that God will provide, he's not just going to take us somewhere and leave us in the lurch, something that I'm very much reminding myself of constantly as well, because I tend to be a worrier. But this is a situation where it's like, okay, right now I'm feeling worried about it, but God, I'm giving it to you because I know that you're going to provide, and I'm just going to worry about seeking you first. Well, not worry about it, I'm just going to do it. In Matthew 6, verse 31 to 33, he says, "Do not worry, saying, what shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or what shall we wear? For the pagans run after all these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well." And I think it's really important for us to understand that we don't give to God and we don't put his kingdom first just so that he will give us things. It's not a bargain. It's not I'll do this for you, God, but only if you give this to me. That's not how it works. It's we're going to just faithfully sow into God's kingdom and faithfully do the things God's called us to do, with the assurance, living, being content that God is going to provide as we go. And speaking of being a worrier, one of my favorite verses is in just before Philippians 4 verse 13 that we've been reading. Back in verse 6, he says, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus." I really think Paul knew that peace personally for himself, part of why he could be so content. He knew to give his worries to God. He knew to do that with thanksgiving. And he knew that in the midst of everything, that he could have the peace that God gives and that he could be content in all circumstances. So, is there anything at the moment that you're worrying about that you need to trust God to provide for? I don't know what it might be. I know in my mind what it is for me. But is there anything you're worrying about that you need to start trusting God to provide for? Because the truth is that we can be content in all circumstances with the assurance that he is going to provide, that if he's called us to do it, and if we're walking the path that he's called us to walk, that he's going to provide and he's going to give us the strength to do it. We can do everything he's called us to do through him who gives us strength. So then the last thing is to know that it's his strength. He's the one who gives you strength. It's not your own strength. And what I really like about this is that it's not just strength that he gives you now and then, that's it, but it's a continual strengthening. He gives us strength. It doesn't say he gave us strength, it says he gives us strength. It's continual. As we keep doing the things he's called us to do, he keeps giving us the strength to do them, which I really like. And the truth is, and I know that we know this, when we try to do things in our own strength, it's not going to go well. We might be able to last for a little while and cope for a little while, but in the end, it's not going to go well. I think in 2 Corinthians, he talks about something very similar. Paul's talking about the struggles that he's gone through again. And he's talking about being tormented by this thorn in his side, which is from Satan. And in the midst of all of that, in the midst of that struggle, God says to him, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." And then he says a little bit further down that he delights in his weaknesses. He delights in the insults, in hardships, in persecutions. "For when I am weak, then I am strong." And I think we're talking about God's strength, that some of the times I have felt the weakest have been the times I've noticed God's strength the most. That he definitely gives us the strength to get through those hard times. For me personally, I've had, as many of you would know, some very, 10 years ago, 11 years ago now, some very difficult pregnancies where I was really afraid and really worried, and just they were a big, big struggle. But I remember at the time after Caleb was born, and that was just really, really rough, Adrian praying, and just I was feeling very weak and like I didn't really know. My faith and my worry was very high and my faith was very low. But I remember Adrian praying and being like, we've got this and we're going to trust in God, and, you might be weak, but I'm going to stand here and I'm going to, God's strength is there and I'm going to pray for that. And I think we noticed it in those times. About 5 years ago, I also went through another really rough couple of years, just personally, and I know that the only way I got through that was in God's strength. And so I think sometimes, when we're weak, we really notice God's strength. When we're weak, we understand it's his strength that's getting us through. But the truth is that it's not just the strength for those really hard times. It's the strength for everything that he's asked you to do, whether it's a good time or a bad time. So I want to encourage you, in order to know his strength, to stay close to God and allow him to refresh you on a daily basis. I know when I just really need some strength and I'm struggling, and if I just sit down and sit in stillness or put on worship music or read my Bible or whatever it is that you need to do, God always shows up and refreshes and helps me to keep going moment by moment, day by day. It says in Isaiah 40 that those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint. His strength is always there for us. So I encourage you to get in and be close, stay close, and to allow him to refresh you with his strength on a daily basis. And especially when times are tough, when you're doing the things he's called you to do and it just seems really, really hard. And I think something else that's been a personal thing for me as well has been knowing the promises that God's given me and standing firm in those when times have been really hard as well and when times have been good. I know that when I've done that I've just been able to know his strength and rely on his strength, because I know that what he says is true, that he who promised is faithful, that he's not going to tell me something and then renege on that. When God says he's going to do something, he's going to do something. We can have that assurance. We can be content knowing that, his promises for us are true. And I don't know, for me, that's been a way that I've really practically known God's strength and been able to live in the strength. So, is there something that you've been relying on your own strength for when you really should have been relying on God's strength? So, if we go back over those verses, let's start from Philippians 4 verse 12, when he says, "I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I've learnt the secret of being content in every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do everything through him who gives me strength." Just like Paul, he's given us the grace to live the life he's called us to live. Just like Paul, we can learn to be content in any and every situation, in any and every circumstance, whether it's a good circumstance, whether we've got lots, or whether it's not so good, whether we have nothing, we can be content in who God is and know that if he's called us to do it, we can do those things through him who gives us strength. And I just want to finish off by giving a bit of a note for the mums who are here, because it's Mother's Day and that feels like a good thing to do. And really, I mean, what I'm about to say goes for any parent, but it's Mother's Day, so it's just for you mums. Raising kids is, if God has blessed us with kids, it's very much something that God has called us to do. It's part of our ministry. Seeing kids, like we said before, being in church and raised up to know who he is and to know his love is a huge part of our ministry. And God has graced us to do that. He's given us the strength to do that. And not just has he given us the strength, he continually gives us the strength to do that. So it's very much something that he has called us to do. And we can do all of that through him who gives us strength. So I just want to say that, and Adrian said it before, but I want to say it again, that God sees you. He sees what you're doing. He sees the sacrifices that you're making. He sees all the notes that you have to sign, and he sees all the appointments that you have to book, and he sees all the lunches you're making and the dinners that you're making and the sports that you're driving the kids to, and he sees the tantrums that the kids are throwing, and he sees how hard it is for you when they're sick, and he sees it all. He sees the good things. He sees the bad things. He sees, and I mean, this isn't just for parents with younger kids, but even adult kids. God sees your love and your care for those kids who are wherever they are, and your love for your grandkids, and he sees it. He sees your desire to love on them and to bless them abundantly. And he knows those moments when it's so hard that you just want to go and cry in the room. I think probably every mum has done that at least once, probably more. He sees those moments when it's so hard, and he sees those moments when it's so good. And I just want to say that you are totally amazing, and that you are totally graced to do that. That is part of your ministry, and it is, when God calls you to do something, he doesn't leave you in the lurch. He's there with you every part of the way, and he continually, every day, is giving you strength to be able to do that, no matter what the circumstances are, whether it's a good time and whether it's a bad time. And goodness knows, every single parent here knows that we have the good times and we have the really rough times as a parent. But God is there strengthening us and giving us the grace to do that all the time. So I just want to say that to the mums, particularly today, to all the parents as well. It's not just a mum's thing, but to the mums today, God sees you and he loves you and he cares about you, and he is so appreciative of the sacrifices that you make for him, for his kingdom. Cool, I'm going to pray.